Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. So if you're already curled up under a blanket, maybe with the room lights dimmed to that soft warm glow, just settle in. We're drifting back a few centuries. Back to a time when the ocean was colder. The ships were creakier and the people aboard them smelled like old rope, fish, and whatever passed for hygiene on a Tuesday. But somehow, these same pirates managed to sleep better than you'd expect, even on nights when the wind cut like a cheap medieval razor and the water froze to the rigging. And yes, we're talking about people who regularly drank whatever grog-like substance was handed to them. Yet they still got surprisingly decent sleep, because of course they did. Tonight we're going to float slowly into that world. No battles, no swashbuckling, no dramatic boarding action. Just the soft, rocking sway of a medieval ship and the very unglamorous, very practical ways pirates kept themselves warm, sane, and asleep. And along the way we'll meet a few figures whose lives were, let's call them, creatively chaotic. People who somehow managed to steal, fight, drink, complain, freeze, and still tuck themselves in with a kind of rough nautical comfort. So take a breath, let your shoulders drop, and let's drift into the quiet corners of medieval piracy. Because while most people imagine pirates as loud, chaotic, and constantly shouting "Yah!", the truth is that after dark, things got pretty calm, mostly because they were exhausted, but we'll get there. Let's start with the ship itself. Medieval ships weren't exactly built for comfort. They were made to carry cargo, occasionally kidnap people, and survive storms that felt like someone upstairs was angry at the concept of boats in general. But there's one thing the ship did well. It rocked, constantly, slowly, predictably, the kind of motion that modern sleep apps would charge a subscription for if they could bottle it. This natural sway did half the work for tired sailors. After spending all day climbing rope ladders, yelling into the wind, scrubbing decks, or doing whatever job they drew the short stick for, they decollapse into sleep with the kind of unconscious loyalty you usually see in overworked students and new parents. But we're not here to talk about ordinary sailors. We're drifting toward the wonderfully dysfunctional world of pirates. And pirates were nothing if not creative, especially when it came to surviving cold nights. They had to be. Most of them couldn't afford proper coats, blankets, or anything resembling insulation. So they improvised, and surprisingly it worked. One of the strange truths about pirate sleep is that they slept in groups. Not because they were bonding or forming a cozy community circle, but because body heat is free and piracy is mostly about saving money. You might imagine a tough, rugged pirate sleeping alone under the stars. But in reality, half the crew was usually squeezed together like a human lasagna. It wasn't glamorous, but it was warm enough to avoid waking up as an icicle. Let's float over to another charming detail: their bedding. Pirates didn't really have beds, they had hammocks. And hammocks, surprisingly, were comfortable. They also kept you off the freezing planks below. Hammocks hugged the body, trapped heat, and swayed gently with the ship. Basically, medieval pirates were sleeping in what would later become the cool, minimalist furniture of trendy tropical resorts. Ironic, considering most of them had scurvy and questionable dental futures. And yes, hammocks also discouraged rats from chewing on your boots while you slept, which is a pretty solid bonus in the grand scheme of things. But the real secret to pirate sleep wasn't the hammock or the human lasagna effect, it was exhaustion. Pure bone-deep exhaustion. These men worked until their muscles gave up on the concept of consciousness. Sleeping was less of a choice and more of a physical shutdown, which is honestly the most relatable part of pirate life. Now, before we drift deeper into the cold nights and strange sleeping habits, let's introduce one of the personalities of tonight's sleepy detour. Because what's a relaxing historical monologue without someone mildly unhinged guiding the tone? Allow me to present Olivier the Frozen Beard de Montréal, a medieval privateer who spent most of his career in the North Atlantic, a region that takes pride in being aggressively unpleasant. Olivier got his nickname because during one famously brutal winter voyage, his beard literally froze into a single stiff object. According to the men who sailed with him, he could probably have used it as a weapon if he swung hard enough. Now, Olivier was not the brightest lantern on deck. He tried to warm himself by placing heated stones near his hammock, which is a bold choice when everything you own is flammable. He also had a habit of yelling at the wind as if it were a disrespectful intern. But Olivier had one skill that made up for his questionable decision-making. He slept anywhere. On rigging, on barrels half submerged in snow, it didn't matter. He had the gift of unconsciousness. Olivier also developed a trick he swore by. He slept in all his clothes, which was basically every layer he owned. Every shirt, every coat, anything that wasn't nailed down. He walked around like a medieval onion, but he slept warm, mostly because he lacked the flexibility to move, and therefore couldn't accidentally wiggle into a cold draft. And here's where things get fun. Pirates actually learned from people like Olivier. If someone found a ridiculous method that worked, the entire crew copied it. That's how you end up with groups of pirates sleeping in layers of wool, salt-stiffened shirts, stolen coats, and whatever fabric they could smuggle. They looked like badly wrapped cargo, but they slept comfortably enough. Now, let us float to something else pirates did that medieval nobles never could have imagined. They slept by the stove. Ships had a small cooking fire, usually inside a cramped, smoke-filled corner that qualified as a kitchen. Pirates rotated turns, sleeping near this area on cold nights. The warm air wasn't clean. It wasn't pleasant. It smelled like fish, salt pork, and whatever died in the corner last week. But to a pirate, warmth beat elegance every time. Compare that to medieval royalty, who with all their wealth, still managed to sleep in freezing stone bedrooms. Some of them slept worse than pirates. Honestly, medieval nobles spent half their nights shivering under 20 layers of fabric while complaining about drafts. Meanwhile, pirates were passing out in hammocks like warm, soot-covered burritos. But we'll get to the dysfunctional royalty soon enough. For now, we're staying with the pirates, because these people, wild, questionable, and deeply practical, understood something most medieval elites didn't. Warmth is a group project. Let's drift a little deeper into the night. The ship is creaking. The air is cold enough to make your teeth rethink their commitment to your mouth. And yet, the pirates are settling into sleep with the kind of calm you'd expect from people who absolutely should not be calm. These are men who spent the day climbing wet ropes, raiding ships, arguing about food, and occasionally yelling at the horizon for looking at them the wrong way. But nightfall turned them into something almost peaceful. Almost the trick is that pirates had a rhythm, a predictable one. And humans, even the questionable ones, love routine. Even if that routine included threats, mold, and the constant chance of getting hit in the head by falling rigging. Let's ease into one of those nightly routines now. Because on a ship full of people who hadn't bathed in a questionable number of weeks, bedtime came with a few steps. The first was drying off. Because medieval ships had absolutely mastered the art of being perpetually wet. Rain, ocean spray, humidity, spilled grog, everything contributed to that classic damp old sock atmosphere. Pirates hung their wet clothes near lanterns or the cooking fire with the hope that something, anything, might feel less soggy. Spoiler, it usually didn't. Next came the warmth hunt. Pirates weren't shy about stealing someone else's spot near the heat. This led to small, sleepy arguments that sounded more like grumbling bears than humans. Someone always tried to claim they had seniority. Someone else insisted they were colder. The cook usually won, mostly because he sat closest to the fire and threatened to throw anyone overboard if they complained. By the time everyone settled, the ship grew quiet. And here's the strange part. Pirate ships were cold, cramped, rank, and uncomfortable, but they were also oddly safe. At least, safe from social rules. Nobles spent nights thinking about heirs, rivals, land disputes, or whether their cousin would marry the wrong duke. Pirates didn't have these problems. No one expected them to behave. No one cared if they slept with their boots on or if they drooled on the deck. Their only job was to stay alive and not annoy the captain. Which brings us to another character drifting into tonight's sleepy chaos. Meet Captain Halvor Grimson, a Viking-descended privateer whose personality could be described as aggressively unimpressed. Halvor captained a cold-water vessel, known for being miserably damp. He claimed he didn't feel cold, which his crew described as an obvious lie, but fine, whatever helps him sleep at night. Halvor had a nightly routine that became ship tradition. He walked the deck once, muttered something vaguely threatening at the waves, then went below deck to sleep inside a fur-lined hammock that smelled like salted cod. His crew thought this was the height of luxury, a fur hammock. That was basically royal treatment. But what made Halvor memorable was his rule. If you're awake after midnight, you're working. This meant the entire ship went to sleep as quickly as possible. Insomnia was simply not allowed. Pirates became experts at shutting their eyes instantly, even the anxious ones, even the ones expecting a storm. Halvor believed sleep was essential to survival, and he wasn't wrong. A tired crew made mistakes. Mistakes got you wet, cold, or dead. Sometimes all three. Now, while pirates were bundling themselves like salted fish to keep warm, nobles across Europe were doing something surprisingly similar but more dramatic. Let us drift to the castles for a moment and meet a royal disaster who could have used a pirate's common sense. Enter Charles VI of France, best known for thinking he was made of glass. Yes, glass. As in, don't touch me, I might shatter. Charles slept terribly. Every creak of the castle made him panic. He wrapped himself in layers of blankets, convinced his fragile body needed protection from drafts, reality, and logic. His servants tiptoed around him. And yet, despite his palace, his wealth, and his bed that probably weighed as much as a small boat, he still slept worse than a pirate in a hammock full of frost. This contrast became a running joke among sailors. While royalty had featherbeds and fires so large they could roast an ox, pirates had simple setups that actually worked. Hammocks didn't collect cold air. Wooden beams radiated a bit of trapped warmth. And humans, piled together or strung up in cloth cocoons, generated enough heat to turn a freezing night into a tolerable one. Back on the ship, the crew shifted gently with the rolling waves, and this rhythmic rocking mattered more than they realized. It triggered a biological response, something primal, like how babies fall asleep when someone carries them. The ocean was their caretaker, rocking the entire ship with a steady pulse. Even Halvar, who pretended to be unbothered by the cold, often fell asleep mid-sentence. His hammock cradled him like a giant salty burrito. The crew whispered jokes about it, quietly, very quietly. But we also need to talk about pirate blankets, because they weren't really blankets. They were whatever cloth a pirate could steal, salvage, or repurposed. Old sails that smelled like fish, coats taken from prisoners, thick woven mats. Anything was fair game. Pirates didn't believe in matching sets, they believed in warmth. And while these makeshift blankets were heavy and stiff, they held heat. Pirates layered them like lasagna. Multiple layers trapped warm air and turned their sleep corner into a cozy fort. The cold air above might be miserable, but underneath the cloth layers, surprisingly snug. Let's float now to another crew entirely. One that worked in the Mediterranean, where winters were still cold but not North Atlantic brutal. This crew sailed under Isabella of Messina, one of the few female pirate captains of the early medieval period. Isabella had no patience for cold. She grew up in a stone fortress where winters seeped into your bones and stayed there. When she became captain, she introduced something unusual: heated stones wrapped in cloth. Her crew called them sleep stones, though one unfortunate sailor called them burning misery rocks after dropping one into his hammock. The name didn't catch on. These warm stones were placed near the feet. They radiated gentle heat that lasted for hours. Medieval nobles also used this trick, though they called them bed warmers and charged impressive sums of money for decorative ones made of silver. Pirates did the same job with rocks and rags, because pirates always went for the affordable option. Isabella slept with two of them, one at her feet and one near her hands. Her crew claimed she looked like someone storing emergency potatoes, but she slept well, better than most kings. By now our imaginary pirate ship is quiet, lanterns sway, the air is cold, but the bodies are warm. The hammocks cradle their sleepers, and even the miserable sailor who took the shift next to the cold wall is drifting off. So why did pirates sleep surprisingly well? Because pirate ships, for all their chaos, removed a lot of the stress that nobles suffered. Pirates didn't plan dynasties, they didn't worry about royal politics. They didn't lie awake imagining assassination attempts or worrying about marrying their cousin's cousin. Their problems were immediate and practical. Eat, work, sleep, repeat. And in that simplicity, sleep came easily. Drift back below deck. The air is thick, not in a cozy way, more in a several humans have been living in this wooden box for months kind of way. But despite the smell, pirates settled into sleep with a sense of routine that felt almost domestic. If you ignored the grog, the shouting, the knives, and the general lack of soap, by now, most of the crew is drifting off. Hammocks sway like lazy pendulums. A few people snore with the confidence of men who have absolutely no shame, and someone in the far corner is muttering something that might be a prayer or might just be complaining about the cold. Hard to tell. The night is calm, and in that quiet, the ship groans softly like it's also tired of working for a living. The sea outside is black and cold, but the inside of the ship is warm in its own scruffy way. This is when pirates slept the deepest. Not during storms, not during raids, not during travel days when everyone was running around doing things no one wanted to do, but during these still moments. The kind when the only real sound is the ocean breathing. Let's float over to another ship, a different pirate entirely. Someone whose sleep schedule became legendary, mostly because it made absolutely no sense. Meet Roderick Tunaps Bellamy, a pirate who slept twice as often as everyone else, purely because he insisted it made him more efficient. Nobody believed him, but he refused to change. Roderick slept in 2 short bursts every night. The first nap was right after dinner, when he'd collapse into his hammock like a fainting goat. He claimed this nap reset his mind. The crew claimed he looked like a dying eel. The second nap came around dawn, where he'd fall asleep standing up. Yes, standing. He leaned against a beam and drifted off. He called it vertical resting. Everyone else called it concerning. But here's the funny part. Roderick always woke up warm. He slept in so many layers that he looked like a laundry pile with legs. He didn't care about looking impressive. He cared about being warm, dry, and unconscious. A relatable set of goals, honestly. And because he slept in 2 phases, he essentially hogged all the warm spots throughout the night. Someone moved away from the fire. Roderick magically appeared there. Someone left a blanket behind. Roderick absorbed it like a sponge. He was a warm-blooded hoarder. The crew complained, but they also used him as a heat source. Leaning against him was like leaning against a very tired, slightly damp woolsack. Let's step away from Roderick for a moment and glide back to reality. Because medieval pirates had another sleep advantage that nobles didn't. Noise control. Not silence. No. Silence is not a word that applied to these ships. But pirates didn't have social expectations about noise. Nobles used to sleep in huge drafty rooms with servants walking around, clanking dishes, whispering about scandals, and making more noise than you'd expect from people whose job was to avoid being noticed. Royal bedrooms were like airports. People came and went. Lanterns moved. Conversations happened in corners. Servants tiptoed and failed at tiptoeing. Doors creaked. And yes, sometimes someone stood guard at your bedside, which is not relaxing unless you're into that. pirates, they didn't have servants, they didn't have guards. The ship at night was either quiet or full of predictable sounds: wind, water, rope, wood, snoring, maybe a rat chewing something it shouldn't. But that was basically the medieval version of white noise. This simplicity mattered. The brain, even a pirate's brain, likes patterns, predictability, a rhythm. The ocean gave them that. Let's drift again, this time toward the hammocks themselves, the little cocoons of warmth and questionable hygiene that made pirate sleep possible. Hammocks were a genius invention. They solved almost every problem with medieval ship life. For one, they kept you off the cold, wet floor. Also, they prevented you from rolling into someone else during the night, which was a common issue when people slept on planks, and if the ship tilted, you didn't fall. The hammock just swung a bit harder, maybe aggressively, but still safer than the floor. And because hammocks hung from beams, cold air settled below them. Pirates could snuggle into their wraps and sleep warm while the cold collected beneath like sad little pockets of misery. Compare that to castles, where cold air gathered right on the floor and then crawled upward like a determined ghost. Nobles slept in heavy beds, but the cold still seeped into their toes. Some kings tried sleeping in furs, but those furs attracted fleas, and fleas brought diseases. And suddenly the royal cozy evening was more like itching and regretting every life choice. Speaking of regretting things, let's introduce another historical character with a bedtime routine that was unique. This is Emperor Sigismund, a man famous for having the worst fashion sense in medieval Europe. He loved bright colors that clashed so badly that onlookers probably needed emotional support afterward. But his sleep habits were even more interesting. Sigismund insisted his bed be surrounded by thick curtains to block drafts. This was normal. What wasn't normal was that he asked servants to check inside the curtains every night for imaginary sleep thieves. He believed cold air was a creature trying to steal his warmth. Meanwhile, pirates literally slept next to open hatches and were fine. Sigismund also wore a thick nightcap that made him look like an egg wrapped in fabric. Pirates would have laughed him straight into the ocean. Let's float back to the ship, where a new problem appears. Not cold, not noise, not rats. Snoring. Snoring on pirate ships wasn't just common, it was impressive. Imagine 20 men who ate bad meat, drank fermented swamp water and breathed salt air for hours. The snores echoed like tired sea lions. Some pirates used this as a sleep aid, others stuffed cloth in their ears. A few embraced the chaos. One pirate named Hugo Smallbones, who was, ironically, enormous, snored so loud the crew voted to move his hammock near the bow so the sound would blend with the waves. He didn't mind. He said the waves snored back. And here's where things get even stranger. Some pirates sang themselves to sleep. Not loudly, not beautifully, but softly, half-conscious, mumbling old sea shanties until they drifted off. It wasn't romantic or theatrical. It was tired men humming in the dark. The sound was calming, almost like a lullaby for people who definitely needed emotional support, but didn't know how to ask for it. By the time the night reached its coldest point, usually right before dawn, the ship would be at peak coziness, bodies warm, hammocks swaying, the cold held at bay by layers of cloth and collective exhaustion. And in these quiet hours, pirates slept with a peace that kings couldn't buy. Let's drift into the coldest moment of the night. The one sailors always complained about, that brief window just before sunrise when the air turns sharp, the boards stiffen, and you can practically hear your breath asking why nature is like this. On a medieval pirate ship, this was the hour when even the toughest men curled deeper into their hammocks. The warmth they'd built up overnight clung to them like a loyal pet. Losing that warmth meant facing the icy reality of the open sea, and nobody wanted that. Not the captain, not the cook, not even the guy who claimed cold didn't bother him because he was descended from Arctic warriors, which was definitely not true. But here's the surprising part. Even during these brutally cold hours, pirates still slept better than a lot of nobles. Let's start with a royal disaster who absolutely did not handle mornings well. Meet Henry IV of Castile, sometimes called Henry the Impotent. Not the nickname anyone wants, but medieval Europe had the sense of humor of a bored teenager. Henry slept in a massive wooden bed with velvet drapes, wool blankets, furs, embroidered sheets, and enough stuffing to qualify as a small mattress factory. But even with all of that, he woke up miserable, cold, stiff, achy, complaining that the air was plotting against him. Pirates didn't worry about luxury. Their mornings were simple, cold, sure, but simple. Let's drift back to our ship. The first person awake was usually the watchman, who never really slept deeply to begin with. He stood at the deck, teeth chattering, wondering what life choices led him here. Below deck, the first movement came from the light sleepers. Someone shifting in a hammock, someone scratching something they shouldn't, someone muttering into their blanket like an angry toddler. Then there was the sound, that soft creak of wood as the ship breathed and stretched with the morning swirl. It was oddly comforting, almost like a lullaby playing in reverse. But before anyone got up, pirates had a morning ritual that no history teacher mentions. The internal temperature debate. You know the one. The moment where you ask yourself, do I actually need to get up right now? Pirates perfected this. They lay in their hammocks, staring at the underside of the deck, weighing the pros and cons of facing the cold. Usually the cons won. Eventually, though, someone had to move. Usually the unlucky sailor whose turn it was to start the fire. This job involved crawling out of a warm hammock and stepping onto wooden planks. So cold they could make your bones reconsider participating in life. There were mornings when pirates yelped like startled animals when their bare feet hit the boards. These were grown men with swords and criminal reputations, brought to their knees by cold flooring. It's a beautiful mental image. And remember those blankets. The stiff, salty, vaguely crunchy layers pirates bundled themselves in. Well, morning meant peeling yourself out of them like a crab emerging from its shell. The blankets held warmth so well that air from outside felt like a personal insult. This slow, grumpy awakening is where we meet tonight's next character. Introducing Bartram the Red, a pirate known for two things: a giant red beard that seemed to have its own climate, and his hatred of cold mornings. Bartram refused to get up until someone bribed him with something warm, tea broth even. Slightly warm seawater if he was desperate. Bartram slept with his beard tucked into his shirt to guard the neck. He claimed the beard added insulation. The crew suspected it added fleas, but Bartram slept warm, and that gave him a kind of quiet authority. Bartram's greatest accomplishment wasn't a raid or a plunder. It was inventing the double hammock wrap, a technique where he folded himself into his hammock with a spare bit of sailcloth wrapped around the outside like a cocoon. The result looked like a giant burrito with hair. He bragged about it constantly. The crew, jealous of his warmth, eventually copied him. When the ship hit its coldest nights, the entire crew ended up wrapped in these makeshift sleeping pods. They looked ridiculous, but they slept warm, and they slept deeply. Meanwhile, royal families were tossing and turning in their big stone rooms, complaining about drafts and whispering that someone had opened a window without permission. Let's float back to those royal beds for a moment. Take Isabella of Bavaria, wife of Charles VI, our glass-believing friend from earlier. Isabella slept in thick layers of fur that probably weighed as much as the average pirate. But she had a problem pirates didn't: accessories. Nobles decorated their beds like Instagram influencers do, with living rooms. Pillows everywhere. Drapes so heavy they could suffocate a small horse, carpets, silk ribbons, tassels for no reason. All this weight trapped moisture, and moisture meant cold. Isabella actually had servants warm her sheets by hand because she refused to touch cold linen. Yet despite everything, she still shivered through the night. Meanwhile, pirates, wrapped in whatever they could find, slept in warm, breathable hammocks. Hammocks kept air circulating just enough to avoid dampness. Nobles, with all their luxury, basically slept in cold velvet caves. Let's float back to the ship as the sun starts creeping up. This is the moment pirates dreaded, because getting up meant embracing the cold in its full, icy glory. And for most medieval sailors, mornings included the delightful experience of putting on damp clothes. Nothing wakes you up faster than cold, wet fabric attacking your skin. But pirates had a trick. They slept in their clothes, all of them, every layer they owned. Day clothes were night clothes were day clothes. There was no distinction. Fashion was not part of the pirate lifestyle. Warmth was. By keeping clothes on, they warmed the fabric overnight. So waking up meant stepping out into cold air but staying wrapped in their personal heat bubble. Sure, the clothes smelled like someone had boiled them in sweat and seawater. But warmth is warmth to nobles. This behavior would have sounded barbaric. To pirates, it was practical. And practical always wins at 3 in the morning when the world feels colder than your mother's disappointment. Before we close this part, let's drift toward one more unusual pirate sleep habit: the shared sock pile. You read that right. Many pirate crews kept a stash of communal wool socks near the fire. Socks were precious. They dried slowly. They wore out quickly. But on cold nights, whoever woke up first tossed the sock pile near the flames to warm it up. Then the crew fought, not violently, just half asleep, grumbling for the warm pairs. It wasn't hygienic, or organized, or remotely respectable, but sliding warm socks onto cold feet on a freezing morning. That was luxury. Better luxury than many kings ever managed. And that's the secret. Pirates weren't comfortable by accident. They were comfortable because they embraced simple solutions: warmth, layers, hammocks, rocks heated by the fire, wool piled like a small mountain, and above all, the freedom to sleep without expectations. Let us drift beyond the cold mornings and slide back into the soft darkness of a pirate night, because there's still more to explore. And this time, we're re-heading into the quiet hours when pirates weren't fully asleep but weren't fully awake either. That hazy, half-dreaming space where people hum to themselves, roll over in their hammocks, and try to ignore the guy next to them chewing on something mysterious. Because yes, pirates snacked at night. Of course they did. It wasn't planned. Pirates didn't have midnight snack schedules like bored royals who woke up their servants just to bring a plate of candied almonds. Pirate midnight meals were more like, I found something edible and I am going to gnaw on it before someone else does. These snacks were usually awful. Hard biscuits that could break a tooth, meat that had the texture of old rope, salted fish that tasted like someone seasoned it with regret. But on freezing nights, eating warmed the body. Calories mattered more than taste. and so pirates ate whatever was nearby. Which brings us to tonight's next character, a man who leaned fully into this philosophy. Meet Gervas Nightmuncher Pike, a pirate who treated midnight snacks like a spiritual ritual. He claimed that eating before sleep kept his furnace warm. The crew suspected it kept the rats interested, but Gervas didn't care. He kept a stash of biscuits tied to his belt at all times. If he woke up cold, he ate one. If he couldn't sleep, he ate one. If he felt lonely, he ate two. One night a biscuit fell out during a storm. Gervas blamed the rain. The cook blamed Gervas. The rats probably sent him a thank you letter. But there was one snack everyone agreed was the best. Warm grog. Not boiling, not fancy. Just slightly warmed rum water spice mush. It wasn't delicious, but it warmed the chest and made muscles relax. Some crews drank it before bed the way people now drink chamomile tea. Others drank it because they didn't trust the water supply. Either way, it helped them sleep. Now let's drift into the sleepy superstitions that shaped pirate nights. Because for all their toughness, pirates were incredibly superstitious, especially at bedtime. One belief was that the ship chose who slept best. If your hammock swayed gently, the ship liked you. If it jerked aggressively, the ship was annoyed. If it dumped you onto the floor, the ship strongly advised you to apologize. This led to late-night whispering, where half-asleep pirates mumbled apologies to wooden beams. You haven't lived until you've imagined a tough, scarred sailor trying to make peace with a plank. Another superstition said you shouldn't sleep with your feet pointing toward the bow. It brought bad luck, or storms, or nightmares. The story varied depending on who told it, but the result was that half the crew slept at weird angles to avoid offending the ship. If a noble walked in and saw this, they'd assume pirates were insane. Pirates thought they were being cautious. Then there was the belief that sleeping under a lantern kept evil spirits away. This worked fine until the lantern dripped hot wax onto someone's forehead, which was less spirit protection and more unwanted medieval spa treatment. But the strongest superstition was about the warmest corner on the ship. Every crew believed one specific, unassuming corner below deck was the warmest. They didn't know why. Theories ranged from it's near the kitchen wall to a friendly ghost sits there. But every crew had this spot, and sleeping there was considered a blessing. On some ships, the corner rotated nightly so everyone had a fair chance. On other ships it was dominated by whoever had the loudest personality. Some crews held raffles. One crew famously held thumb wrestling matches. Another had a nightly chant, though no one remembered the words because everyone fell asleep halfway through. On Halvor Grimson's ship, the warm corner was known as the Dragon's Nest. Why? Halvor once said the air felt like a warm dragon lived there. Nobody questioned him. When a man like Halvor names something, you accept it, even if it makes no sense. The Dragon's Nest was so coveted that the crew developed complex negotiations to decide who slept there, trading work shifts, offering extra grog. One pirate even offered his boots for a turn. His boots were stolen anyway, because pirates are pirates. But here's the funny part. The warm corner wasn't actually warm. Not scientifically. It was maybe 1 degree warmer at best, but the belief made it feel warmer. And that psychological warmth helped pirates drift off more comfortably than kings sleeping under piles of expensive blankets. Let's drift now to another type of warmth entirely. Camaraderie warmth. Pirates weren't sentimental people. They didn't go around hugging or giving heartfelt speeches. But they did care about each other in practical ways. If someone was cold, they tossed him an extra cloth. If someone's hammock broke, they helped tie it back up. If someone snored loudly enough to shake the ship, they mocked him but still let him sleep. Nobles, they hired people to hold candles. Pirates, they shared heat like a community project. And because pirate crews relied on each other completely, they formed a type of trust that most nobles never experienced. They slept shoulder to shoulder without thinking twice. They loaned coats. They took the worst shifts when someone fell ill. They warmed socks for each other. Not because they were saints, but because survival required teamwork. This quiet, practical care created a sense of safety in safety. True. Simple safety helps people sleep deeply, even in freezing weather, even in clothes that smelled like damp regret. Before this part closes, let's drift into one more personality, a royal one, and predictably, a dysfunctional one. Enter Louis XI of France, also known as the Spider King. Louis was paranoid enough to make conspiracy theorists look relaxed. He slept in a small room deep inside his castle because he feared assassins. He barricaded himself with furniture. He hired guards. He locked himself in with iron bolts. Yet despite all of this, he slept terribly. Louis once wrote that the sound of wind against the castle walls kept him awake. Imagine telling that to a pirate who slept through storms, cannon fire, and the sound of Hugo Smallbones snoring like a drowning walrus. Louis had wealth, warmth, and walls. Pirates had hammocks, cold air, and rats, and the pirates slept better. So, now that you're fully familiar with how pirates basically turned winter survival into a lifestyle choice, let's drift forward into another quiet corner of their nightly routine. This one is weirdly charming. It's what I like to call the pirate blanket economy, or, as one quartermaster wrote in his logbook, the nightly negotiations for rags and warmth. Very poetic. Very on brand for a man who probably hadn't bathed since the last solar eclipse. Picture this. The sun drops, the deck stiffens, the temperature settles into something that makes your bones consider filing a complaint, and the crew realizes it's blanket time, except they don't have enough, because of course they don't. This is a pirate ship, not linen and things. So what do? They trade for them, quietly, casually, with the same energy teenagers use to trade snacks during lunch period. A man with a half-decent wool scrap suddenly becomes a miniature king. Another guy who owns a blanket that doesn't smell like a wet goat becomes, basically, a short-term landlord. And the whole scene plays out in these sleepy Lonaji barters: a mug of watered-down rum for a corner of a blanket, a spare pair of socks for the privilege of sleeping next to someone with body heat, half of tomorrow's ration in exchange for getting the hammock spot farthest from the draft. Nobody is yelling, nobody is fighting. It's winter, they're tired, they're cold. The only thing they want is to get horizontal and stay that way. You could almost call it adorable if you ignore the fact that every one of these men has probably robbed someone in the last 72 hours. Let's float to another quiet little truth: the frozen deck nap crisis. This sounds dramatic, but remember, we're keeping things soothing. It's basically what happened whenever a pirate tried to take a nap on deck during a cold spell. Sometimes the hammocks were packed. Sometimes the below-deck area smelled like 40 men sweating in an oak barrel, which, to be fair, was exactly what it was. So a few pirates thought, you know what, fresh air, let's be bold. And then they realized the deck was colder than the emotional temperature at a Habsburg family reunion. But here's the thing: the human body is stubborn, especially pirate bodies, which were basically built out of salt, rum, and questionable decisions. They'd settle on a spot, shrug at the frost on the railing, and lie down anyway. They slept like rocks. They slept like they'd paid money for this experience. They slept like their spinal column had signed a treaty with hypothermia and nobody woke them up. That was the rule. If a pirate was asleep, you leave him alone. The logic was simple: an unconscious pirate is a peaceful pirate. And a peaceful pirate isn't swinging a cutlass at someone for stepping on his boots. So the crew quietly tiptoed around the people who had voluntarily turned themselves into deck sculptures. The real trick to sleeping on the cold deck wasn't bravery, it wasn't toughness, it wasn't even rum. It was what the old logs call thermal companionship, which is a very formal way of saying they slept in piles. Pirates did not care about personal space. They did not care about dignity. They cared about not freezing, so if that meant forming a sleepy blob of unwashed humanity, they were fine with it. One man would fall asleep. Another would quietly settle next to him. A third would wander over and take the spot on the other side. Before long, you'd have a row of snoring men lined up like a comically sad row of dominoes. You don't need romance on the high seas. You just need shared survival instincts. Let's drift a bit deeper into something softer, a little more tender, if you can imagine that word applying to pirates. Winter nights at sea were long, the kind of long where time feels like it's dissolving a little. Some pirates hummed to themselves to fall asleep. Others whispered little pointless stories. A few recited prayers, even though the moral structure of their careers was flexible. One log mentions a pirate who repeated the same 3 lines of a lullaby every night for years. No one knew the full song. Nobody had the energy to ask. And then there was the pirate who supposedly told bedtime stories to the rats, quietly, calmly, like it was the most normal ritual in the world. The crew let him do it, mostly because the rats seemed calmer when he did, and rats were their emergency backup entertainment system. Meanwhile, the ship moved in that slow, cold rhythm that only winter seas have, the kind that feels like someone placed the whole world on a rocking chair. It helped them fall asleep. Even the ones who swore they'd never get used to it ended up dozing off like babies. Sometimes they'd get woken up by the sound of creaking wood, sometimes by the wind slapping a loose rope, sometimes by the quiet, existential dread of realizing they were on a stolen ship in the middle of a freezing ocean with no life plan beyond hope tomorrow goes well. But they always drifted back to sleep. Because where else were they going to go? As we settle further into this sleepy ocean night, let's glide into the next part: the surprising pirate belief system around cold weather dreams, and the strange superstitions that went hand in hand with winter sleep. Settle back into the dim lantern light of another frozen night at sea, where the ship sways just enough to remind every pirate that gravity is optional when you're retrying to sleep. And while you might think pirates ignored anything soft or sentimental, this is exactly the point in the evening when they got weirdly reflective. Winter does that. It slows the brain down. It makes even hardened criminals start acting like poets who never learned to rhyme. So we drift into something pirates never admitted publicly. They were superstitious about their dreams. Not in a mystical wizard on a mountain kind of way. More in the sleepy half from I'm cold and tired and trying to make sense of my life choices way. Dream interpretations floated around pirate ships like passive-aggressive comments at royal family dinners. One common belief was simple: if you dreamed about warm weather, good luck was coming. If you dreamed about cold weather, well, congratulations, you were already living that reality, so the dream didn't count. Pirates treated prophetic dreams with the same seriousness modern people give to horoscope apps. They pretended not to care, but if the stars told them today is risky, they suddenly became very cautious around ladders. One logbook from a Dutch sailor mentions a pirate who refused to get out of his hammock for an entire day because he dreamed of a red rooster. No one knew what that meant. He didn't either. He just said it feels like a staying in hammock day. And honestly, fair enough. Let's float over to another warm little oddity: midnight whispering. Winter nights were long, and pirates were insomniacs by necessity. Some couldn't fall asleep right away. Others woke up every hour because a rope slapped the mast or someone snored loudly enough to cause minor structural vibrations. So they whispered to each other, softly, calmly, and almost always about topics that made absolutely no sense. One man might murmur about food he missed. Another would mumble about a girl he claimed to have loved once, although the details changed every time. Someone else would start a philosophical debate at 2 in the morning about why socks always disappear. It never escalated, no big fights, no yelling. Cold nights were humanity's great sedative. Even the grumpiest pirates were too tired to be aggressive. Most of these whispered conversations drifted off halfway through, replaced by snoring or that half-sleep mumbling that sounds like someone negotiating in a language they invented on the spot. Let's shift softly into another piece of their night routine: the art of staying calm in freezing weather. Pirates mastered the psychological side of winter survival without realizing it. Their trick was something a lot of stressed royals never figured out. They accepted discomfort instead of fighting it. Kings having meltdowns in their gold-plated bedrooms could have learned a thing or two from men who slept on wet planks without complaining. A pirate might shiver, he might groan, he might tuck his hands under his shirt and pretend that counted as insulation, but he didn't panic. He didn't sit up screaming about frost or destiny or the unfairness of life. He just breathed slower and waited for sleep to catch him again. Some crews had tiny rituals to stay calm. One ship hummed low, monotone sea shanties to help everyone drift off. Another passed around a small wooden carving of a sleeping dog for good luck. One captain even insisted on telling the crew a nightly calming briefing, which was just him announcing the weather and saying, "Try not to die." That's all. There's something very relaxing about that level of honesty. And then there was the quietest part of the night, the moment when the whole ship finally fell still. No talking, no whispering, just ocean sounds and the slow thud of the hull adjusting to the water. Pirates called this the settle. It was the closest thing they had to bedtime peace. Even the rats went quiet. Even the wind softened. Even the freezing cold felt less hostile, like it accepted its role in the night's rhythm. And the whole ship, a floating disaster full of questionable morals and poor hygiene, drifted into a sleep so deep that even kings with feather mattresses would have been jealous. Let's move on to the next part, where we explore how pirates rotated night watch in freezing weather, how they napped strategically, and why their weird version of rest management actually worked better than most medieval armies. Let's drift back onto the creaking deck, where winter has wrapped the ship in that quiet, frozen stillness that makes even the most chaotic pirate rethink his career choices. And tonight, we're refloating into one of the strangest truths of pirate life. They were better at managing sleep than most medieval rulers, generals, or frankly, anyone who wasn't living in a wooden shoebox on the ocean. We start with the night watch rotation, which sounds dramatic, but it was really a sleepy shuffle of men trying to stay awake long enough to not crash into an island. Medieval navies had rigid schedules, strict bells, harsh punishments. If you fell asleep on watch, you might lose an ear, or a hand, or at the very least, get yelled at by a noble whose greatest hardship was choosing between silk or velvet for breakfast. Pirates, total opposite. They used what I'd call the whoever looks the least tired system, and it worked better than anyone expected. Picture it. The air is so cold, your eyebrows feel like they're hosting a winter festival. The stars are bright enough to make you question why you ever tried reading maps. And the quartermaster looks around and picks a man who seems like he hasn't yawned yet. Up, you're on watch. No ceremony, no training, just vibes. If he got sleepy, he didn't get punished. He just woke someone else up. It was the laziest, most efficient tag team approach to security ever invented. Early sleep scientists would have loved it. Medieval bureaucrats would have fainted at the lack of rules. This system created a kind of natural rhythm. Men who were more alert took longer shifts. The ones who looked like they'd collapse in 5 minutes barely stood up before getting replaced. It wasn't fair, it wasn't structured, and yet somehow it meant the ship was always watched by someone who wasn't half asleep. And here's the funny thing, this flexible, messy, cozy system meant pirates avoided the sleep deprivation that destroyed entire medieval armies. Let's float into strategic napping, which pirates did with the instinctive talent of cats. Any warmish moment was an opportunity, a quiet hour after meals. Nap, a lull in the wind. Nap, anything remotely resembling peace. They'd nap like they were paid for it. Some napped sitting up, some curled like question marks. Some lay flat on the deck, using a coil of rope as a pillow, which is a strong statement about their ability to tolerate discomfort. And yes, some even napped on top of the cargo. Imagine dozing on barrels that held salted fish, knowing that if you rolled wrong, you'd slide off into someone's face. Pirates didn't worry about that. They were masters of the zero-thought nap. Enlightened, in a way. One sailor wrote that pirates slept in fragments. like broken pottery, which honestly sounds more poetic than anything most monarchs ever said. Fragmented sleep isn't ideal on land, but on a ship, with constant rocking, irregular tasks, and weather that can change moods faster than a Tudor monarch, it was perfect. Pirates didn't expect 8 peaceful hours. They pieced together little rests throughout the day, which kept them more alert than most medieval night guards who stood in freezing towers losing sanity minute by minute. Let us slide gently into why this whole system actually worked better than the proper methods used by the big naval empires. Medieval navies believed in discipline, hard schedules, bells ringing every few hours, people waking up because a metal object told them to, which was great for structure, but terrible for the human body, especially during winter nights when you're already fighting the elements. Pirates created a sleep culture that was, and just lazy enough to be effective. They didn't have to meet standards. They didn't report to nobility. They didn't pretend to enjoy the cold. They just slept when they could, worked when they had energy, and rotated tasks based on who seemed the least miserable. Pirates were less exhausted than most medieval soldiers, less delirious than castle guards, less emotionally fried than noblemen who stayed up late obsessing over inheritance drama. Another quiet little detail here is something we can call unintentional thermal planning. Pirates figured out the warmest sleep spots on the ship without charts or instructions. Near the galley, warm under bundles of rope, surprisingly insulated behind the staircase drapery, between 2 men who radiated heat like dying campfires. Premium. Everyone learned where the warm pockets were, and everyone respected them. Even the roughest pirate wouldn't steal someone's favorite warm nook unless he wanted to be shunned during rum hour. This accidental warm spot mapping made winter nights manageable. Nobody complained too much, and everyone felt slightly more human in the morning. As we drift further into the cold, quiet hours, we can move on to the next part: the strange winter rituals before bed, the odd objects pirates slept with, and why some crews developed emotional attachments to completely random items. Let's ease back into the cold, rocking silence of a winter night at sea. The hammocks sway, the lanterns flicker, and the entire pirate crew begins that soft end-of-a-day shuffle that almost counts as a bedtime routine. Not a clean one, not an elegant one, but a routine somehow. Pirates didn't have scented candles, they didn't have herbal tea, they didn't have journals titled gratitude notes, but they did have rituals. Small, strange, and very practical. One of the most common: the clothing shuffle. Winter nights made pirates behave like medieval toddlers dressing themselves in a panic. Everyone layered whatever they could find: a coat here, a scarf there, someone's spare shirt that may or may not have been washed in the current century. Sometimes they wore 2 belts just because it felt secure. There was no fashion sense, only survival. Then came the boot decision, which was, surprisingly, a philosophical debate. Some pirates slept in their boots to keep their feet warm. Others took them off so their feet could breathe, which is a polite way of saying the smell had reached critical levels. One pirate journal mentions a man who slept with 1 boot on and 1 off, because he did not trust the left foot. No one knew what that meant. They didn't question it. They were too tired. Now we float onto something unexpectedly wholesome: the emotional support object phenomenon. Every pirate slept with something beside them, not because they were sentimental. They just needed comfort in the quiet, unstable nights. And since pirates didn't exactly carry childhood toys, they picked whatever made sense at the time. Some slept with rope coils, some with mugs, some with knives that doubled as protection and, well, personal warmth accessories. One pirate reportedly cuddled a chicken for 3 months. He refused to eat it. He named it Captain Cluck. Again, no one asked questions. Another pirate kept a smooth stone he'd found on a beach in Barbados. He polished it every night before bed, like a man gently pretending his life choices were under control. Let's drift into the softest of their rituals: wind-down conversations. These weren't dramatic. They weren't emotional. Pirates didn't pour out their souls in poetic monologues. But they did talk, quietly, in the dark. One might mumble about a storm coming. Another would whisper that he hoped to find land soon. Someone would quietly hum the same 2 bars of a song he barely remembered. Someone else would repeat facts he believed about the moon, which were usually wrong but delivered with confidence. It didn't matter what they said. The point was simple: it relaxed everyone. Voices made the cold feel less lonely. Let's drift toward another charming detail: pirate bedtime items that doubled as survival gear. Sleeping with random objects wasn't just emotional, it was practical. Someone might tuck a piece of bread into their shirt to warm it up for morning. Another would sleep holding a rope, so he didn't have to go looking for it at dawn. A few slept with their hats pulled over their faces, not for style, but because facial warmth was the only luxury that mattered. One pirate slept with a spare spoon. No reason, he just liked it. Sleep habits don't need explanations. And then there were the winter charm objects, which were basically pirate good luck tokens: a coin, a feather, a button, a shell. Nothing impressive, but powerful enough to make a man feel slightly less doomed by weather, fate, or questionable lifestyle choices. Let's quietly slide into the last part of their bedtime wind-down: the final check of the night. This was when a pirate made sure His hammock ropes weren't fraying. His blanket was arranged in the least useless way possible. He wasn't directly under a leak, and no rat had chosen his pillow spot. If all of that looked acceptable, he'd settle in, shift a little, exhale, and let the cold fade as the ship rocked him to sleep. For all their chaos and questionable ethics, pirates understood one universal truth. A bedtime ritual, even a messy, improvised one, makes cold nights easier. As we slide deeper into the frozen dark, the next part carries us into the surprising emotional bonds pirates formed during winter nights. Why some friendships only appeared after sunset, and how cold weather turned rough men into unexpectedly soft companions. Now, as the night stretches toward its coldest hour, we drift softly into the quiet heart of pirate companionship. Yes, pirates were ruthless, self-interested, and generally smelled like bad decisions, but winter nights on a ship had a way of softening even the roughest edges. Shared cold made strangers into allies, and allies into oddly warm companions. There's a hammock, a bundle of rags, and the relentless Atlantic chill. If you were lucky, someone didn't snore too loudly next to you. If you were really lucky, they offered to share a bit of their blanket or the warmth from their body. And if you weren't lucky, well, you learned how to make do. Survival demanded cooperation. Pirates formed tiny winter alliances, often based on who could tolerate whose body odor, who could stay awake on watch without swearing at the wind, or who had the warmest feet. These bonds were practical, emotional, and entirely unspoken, more than most medieval kings would ever experience in the golden velvet isolation of their stone chambers. Let's float over to a man named Jeb Tofias Maloney. Jeb had a habit of sleeping with one foot near the galley fire, the other tucked in his hammock. He did this every night. It probably was, but the warmth it gave him radiated subtly to nearby crew members. They tolerated him. Sometimes they even imitated him. This minor ritual created an unintended communal comfort zone, a warm cluster of sleepy men who drifted together like a human heat raft. And speaking of communal warmth, let's not forget the soft lullabies of the ship itself. The creak of timber, the whisper of sails, the distant slap of waves. Pirates slept to these sounds. Not out of romance, not out of poetry, but because they were constant. The ship itself became a kind of metronome for deep, albeit smelly sleep. Pirates also had quiet emotional supports, small objects they'd carry, a carved piece of wood, a smooth stone, a worn coin from home. These were reminders that the world was bigger than the deck, that life might continue beyond frostbitten mornings and leaky hammocks. Nobles had silks and furs. Pirates had sentimental scraps, and somehow that was enough. Even the more dramatic personalities on a ship softened in winter. The loud, bragging men who spent the day swinging cutlasses and yelling at gulls would curl up with a borrowed coat or share a wool sock with someone they barely liked. Winter nights had a way of leveling human ego. Cold is a great teacher. And then there's the strategic psychological trick pirates employed without realizing it. Acceptance. They accepted discomfort, they accepted noise. They accepted the smell of three men sharing one hammock. They accepted the cold. They didn't complain as much. They didn't panic, they simply adapted. And that made sleep far deeper than anyone in a heated castle room could manage. By the end of the night, just before the first light of dawn nudged the sky pink, the ship was a tableau of survival. Hammocks swayed gently. Boaties huddled under whatever cloth or rope or blanket scraps were available. The cold pressed at the edges, but the pirates had carved out warm islands for themselves. The deck, the corners, the shared blankets, the watch rotations, the rum and midnight biscuits, they all combined into a system of human warmth and resilience. And while nobles slept in opulent chambers worrying about politics, plague, and drafty tapestries, pirates slept better than anyone might expect. Their bodies, their routines, their superstitions, and their improvisations all converged into a surprisingly effective way to survive the coldest nights. Not luxuriously, not elegantly, not quietly, but deeply, consistently, effectively. So next time you imagine a medieval pirate, don't picture only chaos, swashbuckling, or stolen treasure. Picture a man in layers of damp, worn clothing, carefully arranging rags and blankets, sharing warmth with a stranger, humming softly, trusting the rhythm of the ship and the camaraderie of his crew. That was their secret comfort, their nightly survival, their strange, improvised luxury. And as dawn finally creeps over the horizon, painting the cold sea with pale light, the pirates stir. Some grumble, some groan, some rise with remarkable efficiency, but all of them wake rested enough to face another freezing, unpredictable day. And somehow, in that madness, they are the undisputed champions of medieval winter sleep. Because while kings and emperors fussed with furs, velvet, and paranoia, pirates discovered the simplest, most effective principles of sleep centuries ahead of anyone else. Warmth, routine, companionship, and acceptance. And with that, we can quietly drift out of the frozen night and leave the pirates in their hammocks, rocking gently with the waves, dreaming in fragmented, perfect, human ways.